It's great to be here, and lots of appreciation to all the folks at Pause Wellness and the county for putting this on. I think Pause is going to be such a wonderful resource in our community. Before we get going on this conversation here over the next hour, it's obviously a really sensitive topic. And I want to approach that with all of the sensitivity that it requires and deserves. And just want to reiterate for all of us here, if there's anyone who is in the midst of crisis or suffering, there are resources available for you. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline 988. Reach out, and there are people who are ready and willing to assist. I'm grateful that at a setting like this, I can open up the scriptures. In the book of Lamentations, chapter 3, we read, I am the man that hath seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He hath led me and brought me into darkness, but not into light. Surely against me is he turned. He turneth his hand against me all the day. My flesh and my skin hath he made old. He hath broken my bones. He hath builded against me and compassed me with gall and travail. He hath set me in dark places as they that be dead of old. He hath hedged me about that I cannot get out. He hath made my chain heavy. Also when I cry and shout, this goes in now. Also when I cry and shout, he shutteth out my prayer. He hath enclosed my ways with hewn stone. He hath made my paths crooked. He was unto me as a bear lying in wait, as a lion in secret places. He hath turned aside my ways and pulled me in pieces. He hath made me desolate. He hath bent his bow and set me as a mark for the arrow. He hath caused the arrows of his quiver to enter into my reins. I was a derision to all my people and their song all the day. He hath filled me with bitterness. He hath made me drunken with wormwood. He has also broken my teeth with gravel stones. He hath covered me with ashes. And thou hast removed my soul far off from peace. I forgat my prosperity. And I said, my strength and my hope is perished. I don't know who wrote Lamentations, but they seemed to understand and express quite poetically the depth of human suffering that we can experience, and the desperation sometimes that people feel in the midst of that suffering, to the point that they may even contemplate ending their life, and sometimes taking their life. So for the next 50 minutes or so, we'll talk about some of the things that we want to be aware of as family members, friends, church leaders, community members, to help people who are suffering to this degree. You'll notice that as we talk, I won't use phrases like committed suicide or completed suicide. Instead, I'll say died by suicide or survived a suicide attempt. Let's not use phrases like failed suicide attempt or successful attempt. Now, I know sometimes when we talk about how to say things right, it gets a little bit annoying, but language really does matter. The way that we talk about things and frame things informs how we feel about them and what we do about them. So to reduce stigma and shame, let's be sensitive about the way we talk about these things. I'm going to take just a minute to talk about non-suicidal self-injury, sometimes called self-harm, and then I'm going to go through a bunch of stats around suicide. And the purpose for that is not to just do a fire hose of statistics. As we go through it, what I want us to be thinking about are what are the implications? Like, how does this inform what I should do as a loved one, friend, and neighbor of someone who might be suffering? So non-suicidal self-injury, sometimes called self-harms, can happen in lots of different forms, cutting, burning, banging, picking, scratching, all over the body. Sometimes, often, it is done in secret on parts of the body that are covered by clothes so that nobody knows. It's a false idea that people who self-harm are just trying to get attention. Pretty high number of adolescents and young adults, nearly 1 in 5, have self-harmed at least once, 5% of adults. Overwhelmingly female, and higher rates among particular populations like LGBTQ folks, eating disorders, folks who struggle with eating disorders. And it is a strong predictor of future suicide attempts. They are not one and the same. Someone can be self-harming and not making a suicide attempt. But those who self-harm are at greater risk for suicide in the future. There are lots of reasons why people self-harm. Again, it's not just attention-seeking. Sometimes it is about self-punishment. Most often it's about trying to experience some kind of relief from the pent-up pain and distress that they're feeling. We have chemicals in our body called endorphins. They're naturally occurring painkillers, 20 times more powerful than morphine, if you can believe that. It's just that the dose is really, really small. So when we injure ourselves, endorphins are released, and it gives us a momentary sense of relief or release of that pent-up pain and emotion. Now, when it comes to suicide, nearly 50,000 people died by suicide in 2022. That's 1 every 11 minutes. There's been a huge increase over the past 20 plus years in the rates of suicide, and just kind of steadily continuing to grow. Over 1.7 million attempts, and the ratio is about 25 attempts for every 1 death by suicide. More women attempt by a ratio of 3 to 1, but more men die by suicide by a ratio of about 4 to 1. That's typically because of the means that men choose to use when they attempt suicide. They tend to use more lethal means. About 80% of all suicides are men. 70% in this country are white men. It's the 12th leading cause of death. More people die by suicide than die by homicides or auto accidents. So it's quite staggering. Utah's 13th in the nation for suicide rate. And that's actually a bit of an improvement. For lots of years, we sort of went back and forth between 5th and 6th in the nation. Just in the last couple of years, we've dropped down to 13th, but still quite high. These are suicide rates over time. Up top, it's males. Down low, it's females. This black line is combined. Over on the left side would be 2011. Over here on the right side, 2021. So you can see just kind of this steady increase over time. This is by age cohort. So the pink down here at the bottom are adolescents and young adults. This yellow line up here is 45 to 54. And this green line is 65 plus. The blue line right here is 55 to 64. The age cohort at most risk to die by suicide is the elderly, actually. And for a while, middle-aged sort of took over, and then in the last year, elderly climbed back up on top again. This is rates by state. The darker the red, the higher the rate. So what do you notice? Yeah, the Intermountain. What's that?
Something about altitude.
Yeah, something about altitude, perhaps. The Intermountain West has long had the highest rates of suicide in the country. In fact, it's somewhat morbidly referred to as the suicide belt. Now, why might that be?
I mean, there's some studies suggesting
Right.
elevation.
Yeah. One in particular out of the University of Utah a few years ago suggested elevation might play places at higher elevations, rates are a little bit more elevated. So that might be one factor. What else? Gun culture. Really high rates of gun ownership. Yes. Right. Yes, a real strong culture of personal independence and like picking yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. And then the other thing is high rurality. The more rural places have higher rates of suicide. That's true across the country, and the Intermountain West has a lot of rural places. So there's cultural components to that, but there's also access to care components about that. Less access to care. Again, be thinking implications as we go through all of this. So this is means. I promise I have no political agenda here. I'm just presenting the facts. I once was presenting something similar at a local congregation, and a man raised his hand, and he said, well, you know that the people who die by suicide, it's guns from their neighbors or the guns that they purchased illegally, and you just want to take away our guns. And I said, well, no. He was offended enough that he got up and left. So, no political agenda here, there's just the facts. Over 50% of suicides are from firearms, and then you'll notice just over a quarter from suffocation, so that would be things like hanging or strangling, and then 12% poisoning, like overdose and carbon monoxide poisoning. This is means of suicide by gender. So first we're going to look at female. This darker green is firearms, followed by poisoning, followed by suffocation. And you can see that there's kind of relative equity across the age cohorts. Here's men, though. And this darker is, again, firearms, followed by poisoning, followed by suffocation. This is leading causes of death by age group. I know it's really hard to see because it's tiny, but over here are young, over here are elderly. The blue is accidental injury, the green is suicide. So you can see that suicide is the second leading cause of death in that youth and young adult range. In Utah, it's actually the leading cause of death for that age cohort. Young people don't usually die by illness. It's much more rare, right? So you can see that it's accidents and suicide. This is mental health status for people who have died by suicide. Over here, currently depressed mood, just over a third. Current mental health problem, and blue is male, green is female. And current treatment for mental illness. So you can see that there are a lot of people who die by suicide who are not in treatment. It's also really important to note that it's not just depression that creates risk for suicide. Acute, intense anxiety actually has a very strong risk for suicidal ideation and attempt. Psychosis, mania, other mental health conditions are also significant risk factors. So we need to look beyond just depression. This is substance abuse and dependence. So alcohol dependence, nearly 1 in 5. Other substance abuse problem, nearly 1 in 5. I've seen data about 85 to 90% of people who die by suicide do have drugs or alcohol in their system of some kind. They'll drink or they'll take something to lower their inhibitions and then make the suicide attempt. This just demonstrates how things kind of funnel down from thoughts. 12.3 million adults had serious suicidal thoughts. Sometimes we say ideation clinically. And then 3.5 million made a plan, so a smaller number than had thoughts, and 1.7 attempted suicide. Here's some Utah data for you. Utah males up here on top versus national for males. Utah females versus national for females. You can see Utah has a higher rate for both male and female than the nation, and a more precipitous rise. This is by health district in the state of Utah. This is suicide rate by health district. So we're up here in Bear River, which is Rich, Cache, and Box Elder counties. The Tri-County area is like Uinta, Duchesne, and Daggett. Central, or 5 counties in the center of the state. What do you notice about this graph? Rural, right? Those rural areas have pretty high rates relative to the rest. Some youth statistics. I mentioned already, leading cause of death in Utah, that rate has tripled in the past 15 years or so, though we have seen some reduction in progress in the past few years, which is very positive, probably because of some policy things that are happening at the state level. This is pretty staggering to me. Over a quarter of Utah youth at any given time report feeling sad and hopeless. A full quarter of youth. Nearly 20% considered suicide, 15% made a plan. Close to 90% of youth, if they're thinking about suicide, they're going to tell a friend before they tell a parent, a teacher, or a church leader. They're going to go to their friends. Again, think implications here. I'm going to skip that one. Just some special considerations for us. Most of the time, we can see some warning signs, but there is this kind of minority of youth in particular who, on the surface, appear to have it all. They're involved, they're engaged, they're getting good grades, they're on the cheer squad or the football team, they're involved in activities. They might be a little bit more perfectionistic or a lot more perfectionistic and exist in a culture of quiet, like I've just got to achieve and perform. It's about 10 to 15% of kids who die by suicide. So it's not just the kids who are really obviously struggling that we want to be cognizant of. LGBTQ youth are at much greater risk to think about suicide and attempt suicide, as you can see in the stat here. We'll talk a little bit more, though, about caution when it comes to focusing on singular factors. So we'll address that in a minute, but it is a minority population that we need to be attended to. And then when people look back, when researchers look back at folks who die by suicide, 90% of those folks meet the criteria for some kind of mental illness. So of all the risk factors, that is perhaps the most significant one. All right. With all that data thrown at you now, I'm going to be that annoying presenter who asks you to turn and talk with a neighbor. What are the implications? Like, what does this mean for us as a community and as people who care? What should we be thinking about? What should we be doing? Take maybe 2 or 3 minutes and just verbalize that to each other. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. What are implications for us? What do you think?
With this, get help.
Yeah, so important. So we shouldn't just be focused on what do you do if you're having this experience, but it's highly likely that our kids or grandkids or whoever are going to have a friend come to them. What do you do when your friend comes to you? Yep, that's great.
Do in a situation like that.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. And even if the friend isn't directly expressing that they're suicidal, to train our kids to ask their friends if they notice that their friend is struggling or they're expressing some things that might indicate that they are considering suicide, to train our kids to just ask those questions. Yeah, please.
To that prevention modalities.
Yeah.
And
QPR is one. Mental health first aid is another. There's lots of really good programs that train youth and adults on these kinds of things. Yeah, thank you for that. Other implications? Yes?
Learning from each other, knowing that isn't going to be more harmful.
Yeah, well said. we got to be able to respond in non-shaming, non-judgmental, really open and empathic ways. Yeah, well said. So we want to have those relationships of trust and safety that people could come and share with us, and we would be able to be with them in their pain and help connect them. Those are really good questions, and they go beyond the purpose of this presentation. But it does speak to, sometimes we get caught up in these singular factors, and it's actually problematic. We really need to look at the bigger picture, and there's a lot of men out there, a lot of middle-aged men who are struggling with loneliness, with depression, with lack of connection. And I think there needs to be some clinical resources for them, but also some systemic kinds of opportunities to help men who are struggling. So I'm going to make some statements here, and I want you to indicate whether you think it is true or a myth. So thumbs up is true, thumbs down is a myth. People who talk about taking their life are attention-seeking. Is that true or a myth? That is a myth. In fact, talking about suicide is a significant risk factor and predictor of attempting suicide. Suicide usually occurs without warning signs. True or myth? That is a myth. When we look at the full data, there are, on the aggregate, warning signs that we can observe. Now, are there situations where people die by suicide seemingly out of the blue with no apparent indication or warning? Yes, of course. But on the whole, there are some very clear demonstrated warning signs. Now, I'll talk about this in a minute, but I want to be really careful about that and sensitive about it. Because there are some things that we can notice and some things we can do to help prevent suicide attempts and deaths. But that does not mean that if someone dies by suicide or attempts suicide, that somehow we missed all of that or didn't do something right. Be really, really careful about going down that road. And you can see how in someone's mind who is a family member, a loved one, who's lost someone to suicide, and they hear a presentation like this, and what are they thinking? Right? Right. I didn't notice. If only I had. I should have. Yeah. So we really, really need to be sensitive about that. Once someone has made a decision to end their life, there is no stopping them. Nothing can be done. Is that true or myth? That is a myth. Once someone makes a serious attempt, they don't usually attempt again. True or myth? That is a myth. In fact, the single biggest predictor of death by suicide is a previous attempt. Being the victim of bullying is the primary risk factor for youth who attempt suicide. True or myth? Being a victim of bullying is the primary risk factor. It's a trick question, but it is a myth. Again, we want to be really careful about focusing on singular factors. This is complex. It's very complex. Who's at greater risk for suicide? The bullied or the bully? The bully is, actually. And if someone is both a bully and are bullied, that increases their risk even more. Guns used in suicide are most often from outside the home. We already addressed that. Myth. The truth is, they are usually from the home. All right, some risk factors, and we're not going to go over all of these, but they're up here for you to see. So risk factors are just circumstances, events, experiences, situations that might increase the likelihood that someone would consider suicide and die by suicide. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of these. We mentioned already previous suicide attempts is very significant. So we always want to be attendant to that and make sure people have support after they have had a suicide attempt. Access to lethal means is also a very significant predictor. Studies show over and over and over again, when we eliminate access to lethal means or reduce access to lethal means, suicides go down. The data demonstrates that over and over and over again. We also really want to be aware of what are called suicide clusters, or a phenomenon known as suicide contagion. When a celebrity dies by suicide, suicide across the country goes up. That happens at the micro level too. About a decade ago in Grand County, where Moab is, they had a suicide cluster. So we see that phenomenon. Someone dies by suicide and then others follow. So the way we respond to suicide when it happens is really critical to try and reduce the risk for other people. I'm going to skip that one. So this is known as the interpersonal model for suicide risk. It's a researcher named Joyner out of Harvard. This blue circle right here represents two experiences: perceived burdensomeness, like I feel like I'm a burden to other people, to my family, to my community, and thwarted belongingness. I don't fit in. I don't belong there. When people experience those two states together, they're at greater risk to develop suicidal ideation. Now, in a religious context, researchers have found that thwarted belongingness can also be framed as I feel abandoned by God. And perceived burdensomeness can be experienced as shame, which is defined as a feeling of being unworthy of love and belonging. When I don't feel worthy to be loved and to belong to my community, that's shame. So when those combine together, we might have an increased risk of thinking about, considering, contemplating taking our life. The yellow circle over here is what the researchers call acquired capacity for suicide. What that means is, over time, an increased kind of comfort with the idea of suicide. This can happen in a few ways. Certain professions can have, over time, a familiarity and a desensitization to death and dying. Doctors and medical providers, EMS, law enforcement, military folks. That's part of an acquired capacity for suicide. But it can also come through media, social media, video games, movies. Acquired capacity for suicide. And when those two things combine, this blue circle and this yellow circle, those folks are at greatest risk for suicide, death by suicide. Really important implications here to think about, particularly in the context of our faith communities. Comments, questions about that at all? Yeah, access to means is part of acquired capacity for suicide too. They talk about cognitive means, like access to cognitive means, and that's the familiarity and comfort with it. And then physical means, of course, are the means that one would use to take their life. Yeah, there is. Yep. And we won't talk about it today, Di, just because it's a little bit more clinical.
Right, I'm sure it is, but I just figured that that's probably
Yeah, right. Yep. So warning signs, in contrast to risk factors, are actual behaviors or demonstrations or presentations from an individual that might indicate to us they are in trouble and they need help. And these are some warning signs that have been demonstrated over time through lots and lots of research. Again, we're not going to go through all of these. You can take a look at them. But I just want to point out, many of you have heard this idea about extreme changes in mood. That can go in a positive direction, right? So someone is really struggling and suffering, and then all of a sudden you see them lighter and happier and at peace, and it's like, whoa, what happened? And it's possible in those situations that what they've done is made the decision, they've had the resolution, this is what I'm going to do, and they experience a certain amount of peace about it because they're not in that angst anymore. So in those circumstances, what we want to do when we see these warning signs, especially in combination, is ask. We want to ask the question. We know something about protective factors as well that are really important. And you'll notice that there's this theme of human connection. That is probably the most important protective factor against suicide. It's connection and relationship. Religion is a protective factor against suicide. The research bears that out over and over and over again. That's true also for our LGBT youth. Religion continues to be a protective factor, but it's also a risk factor, so it's complicated. And it's a risk factor, especially if they experience thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness, right? Church attendance by itself is not sufficient to create a protective factor against suicide. But personal religious belief and spiritual practice and a community, a religious community, over and over again is shown to be a protective factor. And for young adults, college-age students, there's been some studies that show religious coping is more important to them as a protective factor against suicide than a mental health therapist or university campus resources. So we should not discount the power of religious faith and community when it comes to protecting against suicide. This involvement in extra-occupational or curricular activities is also really important. Like purpose, a sense of purpose and productivity in someone's life is very important for their mental wellness and resilience. So for those of you who are thinking about faith communities, there are some best practices that have been identified for us to help minister to the people in our purview. And it goes back to that culture of connection and belonging. What can we do to bring people in and help people feel connected? We should speak and pray about mental illness just like we do physical illness. When someone is hospitalized for a psychiatric reason, do we take over casseroles and brownies? And if we don't, why don't we? And it might be because it's whispered. You know? That culture should change. We need to identify people at risk and intentionally engage and intervene with those people. We can do that by recognizing those risk factors and warning signs and developing a plan of action to help them. And then, of course, being familiar with resources. We always want to connect people to resources. So if we see someone who is showing a lot of the warning signs, and maybe they're even communicating to us I'm not sure I want to be here anymore, or I don't know if life is worth living, or I'm such a burden to everybody. It would be better off if I were dead. We have to ask clear, direct question. Don't beat around the bush. And if we had more time, I would have you practice. I make my students practice this because it's a little bit uncomfortable, or for some people it's a lot uncomfortable. And we have a tendency to shy away from it. You wouldn't be thinking about hurting yourself or anything, would you? Right? That's sometimes the approach we have. Or sometimes we're afraid to ask the question because we're afraid of the answer. But we need to just project confidence and ask the question with empathy and sensitivity. I've asked this question literally hundreds and hundreds of times. I've never been hit in the face. I've never been yelled at. In fact, what you'll sometimes see if it's happening, you'll see a visible I can share. It's experienced as a relief to people to be able to talk about it. If they say yes, we follow up with, have you considered how you would do that? Because if they have a plan, the risk is increased, right? Then we can do some of these other things. Keep them safe. That means reducing access to means. Be there with them. Empathize. Validate. Do not shame. What? How could you possibly think that? Right? That is going to shut it down really quick. Help them connect to resources, and I have some resources listed at the end of the presentation, and then always follow up to see how they're doing. I won't go into this, I'll just leave it up here for you. Suicide postvention is what are best practices when someone does die by suicide? How do we respond to that to try and reduce contagion and support the people who survive those who are deceased? It's a really important part of good practice in our communities. I have a couple slides of resources here. I'll put this one up for a minute so you can look at that, and then I'll change it to the next one here in a moment. This is back to the book of Lamentations. And the author clearly understood human suffering, but in that same chapter, chapter 3, the author goes on to say, I called upon thy name, O Lord, out of the low dungeon. Thou hast heard my voice. Hide not thine ear at my breathing, at my cry. Thou drewest near in the day that I called upon thee. Thou saidst, fear not. O Lord, thou hast pleaded the causes of my soul. Thou hast redeemed my life. In the work that I do, I am witness to the depth of human suffering and pain. But I'm also witness to the amazing capacity of the human to be resilient. And I further am a witness of the goodness and grace of God, who has the capacity to redeem our lives. Thanks, everybody.